Thank you very much. So I'm Graham Gudgin. I'm a research associate. I was a retired economist basically, but research associate at the Centre for Business Research in the business school just at the back here. And also I have the title, a bit non-operational these days, but of Chief Economic Advisor at Policy Exchange in London, which is one of the big think tanks. Richard asked me to say a bit about how I got into doing this Brexit work. I mean, my background is social democratic. I was part of Wynne Godley's Cambridge Economic Policy Group, which was seen as left-wing in its day. And I then spent a quarter of a century in Northern Ireland because the Wynne Godley's grants were cut off about 5 years into the Thatcherite period, but that sort of research became politically unpopular. And so I worked very happily in Northern Ireland, where I was running a research institute and then became special advisor to the First Minister. But I was partly happy there because Northern Ireland was a sort of Keynesian republic, I think, within the UK, you know, floating on quite high public expenditure. I got into Brexit. I voted for Brexit, voted to leave, not on any economic grounds. I didn't expect much change either way. But I voted for it because I could see the EU slowly, fitfully turning itself into a United States of Europe. And I thought, you have to make a decision. Would you prefer the UK to be a province of this large multinational entity, or do you prefer it to be a sovereign state? My preference was the latter. So my preference was to get out sooner rather than later. Having made that decision, then as an economist, I started to get interested in the various estimates that were put around for the economic impact of Brexit, particularly by the Treasury, but also some academic groups and quite a lot of international organisations. And working with Ken Coates, in my former colleague at Selwyn College, and also Neil Gibson in Northern Ireland. Neil is now he started off as my research assistant, but he's now the permanent secretary in finance in Northern Ireland. It took over Sue Gray's job, actually, but I hope he doesn't finish up like Sue Gray. But, so he's currently running a budget of 27 billion, I think, without any background in the civil service. But seems to be going all right. But together with those two, we were the only group, I think, which completely replicated the Treasury's gravity model to estimate the impact of Brexit, which the Treasury said, if you don't get a deal, would cost 7% of GDP eventually, and the sort of deal we've got, the conclusion is about 4% of GDP. But we replicated that. It took us months. There was about 1 million pieces of trade data involved. It was a big job. And our conclusion out of that was that the Treasury had exaggerated the negative impact of Brexit by about 400%. We tried to talk to them about it. They absolutely refused to meet us. They refused to meet anybody else. And had to be questions in Parliament before they'd even talk to an MP about this. I thought it was a constitutional issue. And we did complain to the then Chancellor of the Exchequer and the Treasury Secretary, who was then one Rishi Sunak. We tried to get an investigation by the Treasury subcommittee, the Treasury Committee in Parliament on the special select committee on this. We failed in that. But both the Chancellor and Rishi Sunak promised that the Treasury would do no more estimates of the impact of Brexit, and they've kept up to that right until the present. So we did have some impact there. But once you get sucked into this, you get sucked into a process where there are estimates of the impact of Brexit coming not so much from academia, but from think tanks and other bodies, and sometimes just by newspapers, media themselves. Almost every week, if you're sensitised to it, it's a sort of tsunami, and it takes a great deal of my time trying to respond to this and understand what people have done and why they've reached their conclusions. So that's how I got sucked into it, and the results have been sucked in. You will hear now. So let's. Oops. Sorry, I think I've messed up the technology already. Have I done that? Let's try and. No, there we are. I've sorted my own problem out. Thank you. So the latest of these estimates, I mean, in the last week or so, Jonathan Haskell of the Monetary Committee, for instance, produced an estimate that Brexit would cost every family in the UK £1,000, or would cost them that. This was repeated very widely at BBC and over the media without any questioning of what this was based on. And almost every week the OBR is quoted as saying that Brexit will cost 4% of GDP. The OBR, by the way, doesn't do any calculations on Brexit. It merely quotes, averages other studies, but it's universally quoted as being the OBR's view. Now, I'd like to link this to the theme of this conference. I take a macroeconomic measure of living standards, which is consumption per head, public and private. So private household expenditure plus public current expenditure, and you can see the trend there. That trend is a 2% trend. Okay, so we've been on that for pretty well the whole post-war period. There was a bit of a boom in the Labour years, but that ended in tears with the banking collapse, partly due to Labour spending, but a great deal to do with big increases in debt, in borrowing, and that's why it came to tears. And so we get right up until the end, and then suddenly we've got COVID. You can't see much effect, I think, of Brexit in the referendum. And right at the end, we get hopelessly mixed up with COVID. By the way, the measurement of GDP in the COVID years is exaggerated. The ONS does a rather good thing. It tries to measure real output in the public sector properly. For instance, in health, number of operations done of different sorts. In schools, how many pupils are taught, et cetera, et cetera. And I hadn't realised that most other major countries don't do that. They just take the expenditure and deflate it. What happened in COVID was because the NHS stopped doing its standard operations, which were being measured, and had to do a lot of other things on COVID. The ONS reported a huge decrease in activity. So I think my daughter, who works at Addenbrooke's, was a bit surprised to know that her output had decreased by 20% during the COVID years when they were all fantastically overworked. So there's a mismeasurement there. So living standards haven't fallen as much as that graph showed. I just reported the ONS numbers here, but and have perhaps picked up rather more. So I just mentioned that mismeasurement point. And here is consumption, again, public and private, as a percentage of GDP. And the only point I want to note here is that in the last quarter of a century or so, it's been fairly flat, so that the ratio of consumption to GDP is whatever it is there. What's that about? 83%. And I only put that up so that I can now move on to talking about the impact of Brexit in the way that critics talk about it, which is in terms of GDP, trade and inflation, rather than living standards. But you can translate anything I say about GDP, you can translate into living standards directly. So, what impact has Brexit had? There's real GDP, that's just a volume index. And I've compared it with the G7 there, and you can see right at the end, really nothing much happening until the COVID pandemic, and then the UK recovers from the COVID pandemic a bit more slowly than the G7. And there's a degree of mismeasurement in there as well, so it's hard to know exactly what that means. But if we look at that later period, here's the period since 2015. The red pecked line is the G7 again. But if I take the US out of the G7 and have a G6, then the UK has actually done better. So our GDP growth looks as if it's a bit worse than the G7, but that's only because of the US. So why is the US doing better? Why does that make such a difference? And the reason seems to be the big fiscal expansion, both under Trump and Biden. So that the right-hand half of that chart is post-2016. And that's the primary budget deficits difference between the US and the UK. And so if it's negative, that's a bigger US fiscal expansion than the UK. See, for most years, there's a big difference in fiscal expansion. So the US has been expanding, big Keynesian push in the US under both these big, well, mostly under the Republicans. But as we know from the Reagan years, that Republicans often turn out to be quite Keynesian. If we compare the UK's GDP growth more generally, it's the solid red line. Sorry, it comes out orange on that screen. UK is a solid orange line, and we can see the UK doing better than most G7 countries, except the US and Canada, again. So nothing much to write home there about. Hard to pick out any effect of Brexit out of that. But nevertheless, people do it. If you're very sharp-eyed, if you compare the end of the chart, which is 2022 quarter 3, with 2019 quarter 4, which has got a pecked vertical line, you can see the UK is just slightly below that, and if you look at the other countries, they're mostly just slightly above it. So there were a lot of stories in the press about the UK being the slowest growing UK G7 country since the end of 2019. But you're picking your dates there. I mean, my general point is UK seems to have done okay, and hard to see any effect of Brexit. Here's manufacturing output, which isn't affected by mismeasurement. And you can see there, for some reasons which I don't fully understand, the UK seems to have done much better than most of the EU countries. Right, I now want to come on to what are called doppelgangers. This is, sorry, there we are. This is a synthetic control method, and this has been championed by the Centre for Economic European Reform. This is a pro-European think tank, and but very much taken up by the media. The BBC, Financial Times, Economist, all do this to show that if you have a counterfactual in the way that it's done here, then the UK has underperformed that counterfactual by about 5.5% so far. So we get lots of headlines saying that already the UK is 5.5% behind. Now it's a bit strange given that we're looking at, we've been looking at GDP and we didn't see much in those comparisons. So what's happening here? So this doppelganger, sorry, that's the nickname it gets, this counterfactual, is an index. Sorry, where have we gone? It's an index built up of a weighted average of 22 other largely rich OECD countries. And I put the weights there. The biggest weight is the United States, which has a weight of 0.3, 30% weight. Then you've got Germany, New Zealand, Norway, Australia, Iceland, all having weights of more than 5%. But pretty well every country gets a weight. There are just 3 at the bottom, Austria, Belgium and Japan, which have a 0 weight. So you weight all those countries together, weight the index, and you get the index that I showed in the previous chart, which was the PEC line there. Now the first thing to say about this, and what's never said in the press, is that these 22 countries forming this index are often not at all correlated with the UK, but you're somehow putting together 22 series of growth in GDP to get an index. And I think you can always do that. If you have enough data, you can always weight it in a fashion to get something which will match the UK. I haven't done it yet, but I'd quite like to put the number of stalks in Middle Europe, you know, and in there as a variable and see if it picks that up as well. But let me just show you what I mean here. So Australia and New Zealand receive quite high weights in this index. And they're the PEC, 2 PEC lines there. And you can see Australia and New Zealand both grow faster than the UK. They did before 2016, and they've continued to do so. So why they're in there as major components of a comparator index, I don't really know. Even worse, Greece is in there. It only gets a low weighting of about 2%, but it's in the index. And you can see as the UK continued to grow before 2016, Greece was a collapsing economy after the banking collapse. But it's in there as part of the index. I mean, this makes no sense to me at all. But the Financial Times and the Economist and so on are quite happy to quote the results of this without any criticism of it at all. Here I've showed, for instance, Germany compared to this UK index. You can see before 2016, that's before the vertical line. Germany, over the whole period since, 2009, had grown at exactly the same rate as the UK. Continued to do so continued to grow as fast as this doppelganger index for a few years, but has then fallen away. I don't think anybody thinks that Brexit has had I think that's about a 7% negative impact on Germany. Sorry, somebody said they do. Terry, I think, might do. He'll tell us later. Here's Japan as well. Tended to grow at something like the UK rate before 2016, and similar to this doppelganger index, but again has fallen away badly since 2016. Sorry, anybody need any clarification?
Hold that until later,
yeah, okay. Sorry, I just wondered if they needed clarification on what this doppelganger was. So Japan falls away as well, but nobody, I think, that thinks that Japan has had a huge negative impact from Brexit. And the doppelganger index is much the same as the US. I've put the US there and the doppelganger index, and you really can't see any difference between them. So if we're comparing with this index, we're really comparing with the US. And as I've already said, the US had such a big fiscal expansion compared to the UK after 2016 that we expect it to grow slower. It may have to pay for that expansion later on with slower growth, but so far it's been growing faster. The next thing that the media rather loves is to say that the big thing that's been affected by Brexit has been business investment. And then some people like Jonathan Haskell of the Bank of England then convert that into a GDP loss. If you have less investment, less capital stock, lower GDP. And here's what they generally do. This chart was in the Financial Times a week ago, and then it was shown twice on Newsnight, BBC Newsnight last week. just in case you didn't get the point first time, they showed it again second time. So the main blue line here is business investment in millions of pounds, constant prices. And what happens is that people, including the Financial Times, put a trend line through the upturn in investment from after the banking collapse from 2009 up to 2016, and then continue that trend on. So you assume that a cyclical upturn lasts forever, and then take the difference between that and what actually happened and say, well, that's an impact of Brexit because it started in 2016. I mean, I think if I'd have got that as an undergraduate essay when I was teaching at Cambridge, I think I would have sent it straight back, but told them to start again. But anyway, Financial Times and BBC is happy with that. If you fit a trend to the data up to 2016 and extend it on, just a regression trend, that's what you get. So it's a much less steep trend. I'll come back to Germany. So here's what Jonathan Haskell did. So he took a trend between 2 points, and those 2 points were 1997 quarter 3 and 2016 quarter 2. That was the quarter in which the referendum happened, and that's the red dotted line. So there's a trend. He continued that on. He said business investment would have carried on that trend. And then he accepted that business investment was rather hit by Brexit. But he thinks business investment would have grown at 2% per annum faster than it actually did through the COVID years. So his dotted red line has a much faster recovery. First thing to say about this is he was using out-of-date data. You can see just on the right-hand side, you can see a solid red line. That's the revised ONS data. So you can see the UK was actually doing much better at the end than Haskell assumed. And this is the analysis that led him to the conclusion that Brexit cost us all, each family £1,000 each. If you fit the regression trend instead of his 2-point trend, you get the lower trend line. And the importance of this is that 2016 then becomes a point well above the trend. So it was a peak of a cycle in a sense. The way Haskell did it, fitting between 2 points, 2016 quarter 2 has to be on his trend because he was only fitting his trend between 2 points. And therefore 2016 can't be above or below trend. So he's actually building that into his analysis. And therefore he can't argue that because business investment was above trend, then the cycle might well have turned and gone down. If I run an equation with my model, we also get a downturn, but business investment is notoriously difficult to forecast. Perhaps the most difficult part of the economy. So I think Haskell's analysis there was absolutely flawed. But that didn't stop the BBC or the Financial Times or the Economist recording that as almost factual. Last point on investment. Here's greenfield foreign direct investments. This is foreign direct investment into the UK, where it's actually a new activity. It's a new factory. It's a new office activity. And that's the value in millions of dollars each year. And the US is higher, but you can see the UK is higher than all these major European economies, and has continued to be so after Brexit. Some critics of this work say, "Oh yes, but the gap between the UK and Spain and Germany has narrowed since Brexit, but the gap between UK and France hasn't, or between the UK and Italy." So again, I don't think there's any particular evidence there to show that investment has been doing worse in the UK, or that foreign investors have been viewed the UK as a poor bet. Sorry, how am I doing for time? I didn't notice when I started. Okay, for a few minutes. Thanks. Right, quickly on to trade. If Brexit's having an effect, we'd expect it to have its biggest effect through trade. After all, this is a trade change. We've left the single market. We're now facing customs checks and higher non-tariff barriers. There are administrative costs now of getting into the EU single market. There aren't any tariffs, so it's only non-tariff barriers, but nevertheless, they're real extra costs. So the solid blue line is UK exports to the EU, and we can see there that they've recovered their pre-COVID levels. Interestingly, UK exports to countries outside the EU haven't recovered. So actually our exports to the EU have done better than our exports to the rest of the world. Now these are exports excluding oil, so we have a declining exports of oil for geological rather than economic reasons. And it also excludes erratics, but it doesn't include cars, for instance, where there's been quite a big problem in just getting components from the Far East, and that's hit exports both to the EU and to the rest of the world. The reason why non-EU UK exports to non-EU destinations have done so poorly, I think, isn't terribly well understood, and there may be people here who've looked at this more than I have. What has come down is not exports so much, but imports from the EU are about 20% lower than they were before. One of the consequences of that is that our balance of trade with the EU has actually improved because exports have done better than imports. But imports are quite tricky. There was, for instance, in clothing, a lot of clothing tended to come into the UK from Bangladesh and then be re-exported out to the EU. And I think because of the trade changes, some of that is now going directly into the EU. So there have been changes in the direction of trade, but not in a way that affects the UK economy very much. Just very quickly, just focusing there on the period just before and after the new trade arrangements came into effect, the end of January 1921. What we can see there was an increase in exports to the EU just before that, and that was probably a stock building. So companies got their exports onto the continent before the new arrangements came in, and then there was quite a big fall in exports immediately afterwards, January and February 2021. And after that, there's been a slow recovery. And UK, I think this is goods exports, not quite, tend to be highly correlated over time with manufacturing output in the Eurozone. And you can see in the period 2020-21 that there's quite a lot of volatility. But by the end, we've pretty well got back to where you might expect our goods exports to be. And on services exports, the lower line is services exports to the EU, and that seems to have recovered back to its previous trend. Our much bigger service exports are to non-EU countries, and they fell a bit and then recovered, but they've done much the same as service exports from the US to the rest of the world. So again, on service exports, nothing much to report, I think. And then I'll finish on inflation. Some people have tried to suggest that the recent inflation has got something to do with Brexit, but that's really a rather hard one to pursue, I think. So you can see there, here's headline CPI inflation. That's the UK, the Euro area, and the US. And you can see they all go up pretty well together and very much for the same reasons of much higher energy costs and other raw material costs. And if we take food and energy out of it, then the UK is intermediate between the US and the EU. But nothing there, I think, to suggest that the UK has performed very differently from anywhere else, and therefore that Brexit's had much effect. So, to conclude on this, my conclusion is that the UK has neither gained nor lost anything much economically from Brexit, much as I expected before the referendum. The main impact on trade is in extra non-tariff barriers into the EU. They're real but not huge, and that's about it. It doesn't seem to have had a very big impact on trade. It probably has had a real impact, negative impact on exports from small companies into the EU. I think where the extra paperwork and so on has made it non-viable. But that doesn't seem to show up in the aggregate figures, so it looks like the bigger companies have just ridden this pretty well. Some smaller companies are affected. Other factors like migration seem to be mainly a matter of changing origins and destinations. So fewer people are coming from the EU than came before, but more from non-EU destinations. And as we know, the figure for last year was 500,000. I think the biggest ever net immigration. So my final conclusion is that look, slow growth in living standards and in productivity is a really big issue. And I mean, I can congratulate you on running a conference on this. You know, and we ought to keep doing that. This is really the big issue facing the UK and many other Western economies. That essentially living standards have stopped rising, now having risen for nearly all my lifetime. And you can see by looking at me, my lifetime is quite long, and rising living standards is something we took for granted, and it's no longer there. And I think the repercussions of this, we still haven't faced them all, both social and economic. But in that slow growth in living standards, as far as I can see, Brexit doesn't play any real role. So I think we should put that aside and focus on the real issues, which are complex enough without bothering about Brexit. So with that, I'll finish. Thank you very much.
Graham, thanks very much. We'll have questions now for David and Graham. Terry, yeah.
My question's for David. You mentioned the measurement of wealth. Of course, that is key to understanding where we are and how we've changed, we being the country or the world, in terms of wealth. But you aggregated, one of the charts showed separately financial and real wealth, and you commented on that. And indeed, this is a major issue, isn't it, as to how we measure real wealth, because I don't think financial wealth is real wealth. I don't think money is real at all. I think it's an idea. But I do think these buildings and we as people and these things in front of us, I think they're real. But I don't see any money here. I just see people and things which are useful. That is, to me, real. Money is just an idea. So I don't think that money, wealth, has any meaning whatsoever. I think it's a null, void concept, money, wealth. I think real wealth, yes, I think this is real wealth. Ideas are real wealth. Now, if you brought in a whole lot of gold coins, I would say that looks like real wealth. They're real, those coins, but you haven't. There aren't any gold coins that I can see. So So that's a sort of rather basic point about adding real and financial wealth together, because to me, if you do that, you've got a completely misleading and wrong and misguided total, even if you net off the debts, whatever they are. Are they real debts or financial debts, or what debts are they?
How do we value companies? And how do companies
You value
engage in investment?
You value companies by the real articles and services they produce.
Yes, and they are going to produce that into the
But
future.
money hasn't come into this. I haven't mentioned anything about money.
Well, yeah, money is...
How would I value this college? I wouldn't put it in money terms, because that would be meaningless. How would you value Downing College in money terms? It's a nonsense. It doesn't work. How would you value the view of the moon last night? I'll leave you with that question.
Do you want to try and respond to that, or let it hang?
It's getting a bit philosophical.
Metaphysical.
I think there is a question about the meaning of financial wealth, because as we know, it's fluctuated enormously, and it depends very much on expectations of the future and so on. And,
Exactly. What I'm trying to do is to order it. At least we can consider it in an ordered framework. And so I'm differentiating between the wealth we're accumulating from the past and then the wealth that we're anticipating coming from the future.
That's not real.
Well,
If you net off financial liabilities, it solves Terry's problems, I think. If you net off financial liabilities of the financial well, it solves your problem because it comes to because the financial bit comes to zero.
okay, let's leave that. I'm not sure we're getting anywhere further with that. I've got a question, Graham. I'm interested in what you say, and I think that obviously the sides that people take over Brexit has influenced the way that what they choose to find in the data. I just wanted to ask you whether you'd looked at, when you looked at the recovery of export, because I would expect to see it in trade first of all, and these stories about small firms, they're only anecdotes, but you could imagine that they're borne out. But as you say, trade's dominated by the trade by large companies who presumably can manage, even if there are higher costs, they'll manage. But I wondered whether you had looked at the recovery of trade within the Eurozone, if you should, the kind of exports within the Eurozone, and compared that to our exports, just to see whether there's any difference there, or whether you could.
So do you mean the exports of Eurozone countries?
Yes, to each other, yeah, and compare with ours.
Yeah, there's a research group in Dublin, ESRI, have looked at that, I think, and they suggest that the UK has done worse. That trade has picked up.
It's picked up by more, yeah. Okay.
One of the problems is that the measurement of exports has changed since we left the EU. Before, when we were in the EU, we had to value we used, I think, VAT returns to measure exports. And now we're a third country in the EU, so they no longer...
We don't have that.
They apply a different measure to third countries. So that's a difficulty in making that in that comparison. But people who have done it tend to suggest that the EU intra-trade has
picked up by more than
faster.
our... Yeah, okay, all right, thank you, yeah. Any other questions or comments? Yeah.
It's just a clarification point, I guess, that someone else also might know, but I was just wondering how many of the trade deals that we had as part of the EU have been, are all of them rolled over into the UK? So I was thinking of explanations for why non-EU trade might have gone down. Is there anything to do with the trade deals that we might not have access to? Or it's just a simple...
My understanding is we've rolled them all over, and we've improved some, so that the Japanese one is a bit more than it was, than the one they had with the EU. And then we've got a few new ones as well, Australia and New Zealand, which are partly kicking in. And I'm told that the big one, the Trans-Pacific Partnership one, should be announced. I was told it'd be announced in March, so it should be announced quite soon, I think. Trans-Pacific Partnership is a bit of a misnomer. It actually includes a lot of the the old Commonwealth, as well as Australia, New Zealand, Canada, are all in there. But it does include quite a number of fast-growing countries. So one of the things I didn't argue it in this talk because I wasn't talking about projections and the future very much. But I would argue that we're undergoing a slow change in the direction of our trade, in the direction of the Pacific countries and away from the EU. And the EU is a very slow-growing part of the world. It's not a bad tactic to do if you can pull it off. I think to withdraw yourself from the slow-growing markets and try and get into the fast.
Maybe slow-growing, but a lot nearer, of course.
And in the long run, India might be the big prize. India is a very highly protected market, like 350% tariffs on Scotch whisky, for instance. So if we can get into that market more, but that is currently, I think, bogged down in a lot of political difficulties, particularly that BBC programme on Modi, which the Indian government has greatly objected to.
Didn't like, okay. Anne.
Thank you. On the question of whether EU exports holding up really has an important social meaning, I just wonder about the sector distribution of this regrowth of exports since the pandemic. Anecdotally from the press, you hear horrible stories about people trying to export fresh food, particularly where bureaucracy for small firms is involved. You also hear about a number of companies moving their head office into continental Europe, which probably leads to a lot of extra within-company transfers of goods and money that didn't occur before. So I'm wondering if those sort of overriding factors, which maybe conceal some of the social realities about the dynamic future of jobs, should concern us. Thank you.
Thanks. Yes, good points. I think the first point comes back to the small firms issue I was talking about. If the BBC or the press want to find somebody affected by Brexit, they almost always go to a small company. You go to some small cheesemaker in Somerset or something, and they say, "Oh, paperwork's really getting me down," and such. So those are real effects, but they don't look as if they're of macroeconomic importance. It may be a bad thing that quite a few of our small exporters are no longer doing it, because perhaps we'd have hoped that some of those would have grown into bigger exports over time. But it doesn't seem to have affected our export total very much. And your second point, the headquarters and the moving was mainly out of the City of London, and Ernst & Young do surveys on this. They think about 7,000 jobs were relocated to mainly Frankfurt and Paris. But quite a few coming the other way as well, which isn't reported. And if we look at the employment totals in the city, it's risen quite a bit. There doesn't seem to be a big impact in the city. And that's one of the forecasts I think that was really badly wrong. Finance didn't get much advantage out of the TCA trade agreement we had, but they've carried on. They find ways of doing it. Just as Cambridge Econometrics has, I think they've managed Brexit quite well.
It spurred us to change anyway. Yeah.
Thanks for that. You use GDP a lot, and obviously we're talking about the impact of cost of living. To what extent do you think GDP is representative of how well we're doing in some generic sense, if you like?
Yeah, I'm still happy with it as a measure. Lots of people do criticise it, sometimes on environmental reasons or the fact that, some things like housework and homework and so on aren't included. But I always take it's just the aggregate of the incomes which are earned by market activities. And I think it's fair enough. I tried to show at the beginning that the ratio of my measure of living standards to GDP was fairly stable. So anything you can say about GDP also applied to...
It's a consumption measure,
yeah.
Okay, yeah. I think it tends to be, because the things that are wrong with it don't change very much in the short term. It's not bad for short-term changes. But yeah, was there another question? Yeah, Terry.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank both of the speakers for very provocative and interesting and well-researched talks. I have one more comment for David, and that is, I agree entirely with your NPV as a value of projects or companies. I mean, of course, you've got to know what rate of interest and whether it's an internal one or what. But I mean, subject to that, I mean, that is how to value companies in terms of what they might produce. And in fact, that's what a bank would ask if it was giving a loan to a company, or that's what a government would ask. If it was, for example, the battery plant up in the northeast, if you were going to save that, you'd want to know what the NPV was of the batteries it was going to produce, i.e. a stream of real things, batteries. And you turn that into money value, present money value. So, now, and to Graham, I've got two lots of questions, both one relating to the economics and the other to the social and political effects of Brexit. On the economics, I find it difficult to accept what you've done, but I haven't done the work. I've basically moved on in terms of the analysis of Brexit. I've just seen it as an unmitigated disaster. My question on the other aspect is, do you consider Brexit to be a political success?
For whom, I suppose, for whom, yeah.
On your first question, Terry, I mean, I think on the data presented, I mean, it's absolutely clear it hasn't been an unmitigated economic disaster at all. And there were plenty of people like you who thought it might be, and it hasn't been. So, I hope we could all accept that. You could say perhaps on balance it's been a bit negative, or well, not many people who say it's a bit positive, but unmitigated disaster, come on. On your second point about politics, I mean, the big thing to say is just how divisive it's been, I mean, socially and politically. And that was quite a surprise to me. I thought one of the things I sometimes reflect on is that right up until the results on whatever it was, 23rd of June 2016, I don't remember anybody on either side saying anything very good about the EU. I mean, those who favoured remaining tended to say, well, okay, the EU is a bit of an irritating organisation, but on balance we should stay, and it's too difficult to get out of. And that seemed to be the balance of opinion right up until that point. And then the next morning, after the result came in, suddenly half the country was in tears, and it really mattered to them, and this was a terrible thing to happen. And I still don't really understand it, but you have to accept that it is the case. The country's been badly divided, and I think that's the reality of the politics of this. And quite large parts of the country, and by and large the more influential, what some people call the Brahmin classes, have tried quite hard to undermine it. I mean, rhetorically, by, for instance, referring to a hard Brexit, when I think we voted for Brexit, So you call what we've got a hard Brexit, make it pejorative. And in Parliament, trying to overturn it. Or I don't know if there are any Liberal Democrat voters here, but I find that the Democrat part of that title I find hilarious, in a party that wanted to overturn the results of a legal and democratically and properly conducted referendum. But there we are. So no, it's been politically very difficult. But it's the Remainers who made it do it. I mean, a lot of people just haven't accepted the result. And I think showed themselves as really not accepting mass democracy in that sense. I mean, living in Cambridge, I have to accept that I'm in a small minority, but I always console myself by saying that nationally I'm in a majority. And that majority consists very largely of working class people. And I think Brexit does matter to them. It's the basis of, for a lot of people, the sovereign democratic state like the UK is the basis of their security, prosperity and identity. And that matters a lot more to working class people than it does to very cosmopolitan middle class people that are in touch with people all around the world, speak languages, you know, shooting off to conferences all the time. So we've got different parts of the population. But I come from a working class background, and so I'm on that side.
Okay, all right.
And
Well,
the
thanks
rest-
very much. Go on, just one more from you, Jeff, then.
Well, I mean, I also come from a very working class background. I've known poverty and prosperity in my life. But you are pretty pejorative with respect about the views of those of us who want to remain in the European Union. And I accept the outcome of the vote. I regret the outcome of the vote. And personally, you see, I feel that I've lost a lot in my life that I valued. And I valued the fact of being European culture, the Renaissance, you know, the Enlightenment. We all share those European roots. Now, you may argue that we still maintain them, and in some ways we do, but they have been made more difficult. The membership of the Horizon Programme and our science and research. The simple fact of travelling around, you know, again, you're very pejorative of those of us who travel. I travel quite a lot because my profession has required me to do so. And it's now much more difficult. I nearly missed a connection in Amsterdam the other day because of the passport check. So, I mean, there are some simple things like that. But the main one for me, actually, is not economic, but it's identity. And geopolitically, if the world is now divided into the American-China nexus and Europe nexus, I don't think there's a role for a third independent nation in that. So I think we have lost an area of influence where we brought, and the European Union feels this, you know, we brought a contribution they valued. It seems to me that's much less valid now we're independent. But so whilst I respect your view, I think I'd probably ask you to respect ours too.
Yeah, I certainly do. Sorry, if I sounded pejorative, I didn't mean to be. I was just trying to be descriptive. You know, that you are the sort of people who voted to remain for perfectly good reasons. I mean, for your, you know, for your own personal self-interest. And I accept you've lost something out of it in the 90 days. Perhaps you'd have preferred longer spells in the sun than 90 days at a time. So no, I accept all that, and I don't mean to be pejorative at all. But there are different interest groups in the country, and I think that the basically working class group, you know, had the majority here, and it was a zero-sum game, and you know, that's the way it goes. And I don't think you've lost a great deal. I mean, you've still got your house in France, and you still go back and forth.
This is a debate that will go on.
Can I just reply very?
All right, go on, Graham.
Reply very quickly to Jeffrey's geopolitical point, which I think is a much more important one. And several of my Remain voting friends voted Remain very much on that reason. You know, they thought being part of the EU was made us geopolitically stronger. I'm just not sure that's true. I mean, it's a fair argument, and I think it's something we can debate on both sides. But the big geopolitical body, the one that really matters in the world, I've always thought, is NATO and the American alliance. I mean, we may get exasperated with the Americans, but crikey, they're the source of our security in the world. And the EU doesn't come anywhere near this. And I'd have thought the Ukraine war, I mean, it has exactly demonstrated that what you've just said isn't really true. I mean, we've kept our influence. We've been the biggest European supporter of Ukraine. And in Eastern Europe, I think that's strongly recognised, and our, the reputation of the UK has risen there. And I think you can carry that over to almost anything else. The sort of things we were cooperating with the EU when we were inside, I don't really see why we can't cooperate when we're on the outside. And certainly the Horizon Programme is one of those. I mean, we'll sign up to the Horizon Programme later this year. It's no doubt about it. They were just using it as a bargaining counter over the Northern Ireland Protocol. That's now been sorted, so they'll let us into Horizon. I'm not sure that matters very much, but it will. It will happen. So I think the things you listed don't seem to me to come to very much in the end, but we can But they mean
Okay.
a lot. They
All right.
mean
Well,
a lot to you, and I can
We'll let you have, as you're a speaker, Graham, we'll let you have the last word, although there are many other words that will be said. Okay, well, let's give a round of applause to both our speakers. Thank you.